The deafening roar of 80,000 souls vibrates through the thick concrete walls of the Texas Stadium like a physical force. The air out there is thick with the smell of spilled beer, roasted peanuts, and the electric anticipation of a crowd waiting for their hero. Blinding white and blue spotlights sweep across the sea of cowboy hats and boots, cutting through the humid night air. But in one brutal, sudden shift, the heavy steel door of the dressing room clicks shut, and that massive wall of sound is sucked into an absolute suffocating vacuum. The silence inside this small, dimly lit room is heavy enough to crush a man. There, sitting perfectly still on a worn leather sofa, is the undisputed king of country music. He is dressed in his immaculate, heavily starched western shirt, the creases sharp enough to draw blood, his polished boots resting on the cold floor. But his shoulders, usually so broad and unyielding, are slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. In his large, calloused hands that have gripped saddle horns and strummed a million chords, he holds a faded, dog-eared photograph. His fingers are trembling violently. It is a picture of a smiling teenage girl with bright eyes and a future that was stolen too soon. From the shadows of the room, the soft, steady voice of Norma Strait begins to speak, breaking a silence that this family has guarded with their very lives for decades. She speaks of the man behind the iron stoicism, the cowboy who almost let the darkness swallow him whole, and the unimaginable agony that nearly silenced his voice forever. The world sees the platinum records and the gold buckles, but in this quiet room, there is only a father bleeding out from a wound that time flatly refuses to heal. The year was 1986, and the Texas sun beat down on the sprawling plains of the Strait family ranch with a golden, forgiving warmth. It was a sanctuary carved out of the dusty earth, a place where the chaos of fame could not penetrate the heavy wooden gates. The air here always smelled of raw leather, fresh-cut alfalfa, and the sweet, icy pitchers of tea that sat sweating on the porch railing. George was riding the crest of a meteoric rise. His voice was drifting out of every pickup truck radio from the muddy banks of the Brazos River to the neon-lit honky-tonks of Nashville. But out here, walking across the dry, cracked dirt with the wind pulling at the brim of his hat, he was not a superstar. He was simply a father, a man rooted in the deep traditional values of the soil. He walked with that slow, deliberate Texas stride, his boots crunching rhythmically against the gravel. By the wooden corral, the dust kicked up in golden clouds as he patiently stood beside his young son, Bubba, adjusting the boy's grip on a stiff lariat rope. George spoke in low, measured tones, teaching the boy the mechanics of the loop, a tradition passed down through generations of men who knew the value of hard work and respect. A few yards away, leaning against the weathered wooden fence, was Jennifer. She was 13 years old, a vibrant, radiant spark of life with a smile that could outshine the fierce southern sun. She watched her father and brother with bright, adoring eyes, her laughter ringing out across the pasture, a sound that George carried in his heart like a sacred hymn. In this household, respect was the currency of love. The words "yes ma'am" and "no sir" were not just manners, they were the foundation of their lives, a quiet testament to a humble Christian upbringing that valued family above any worldly accolade. But tragedy does not respect the peace of good people. It does not knock on the door, it simply kicks it off the hinges. It was a Friday night, and the ranch was wrapped in the profound, comforting darkness of the countryside. The only sound was the rhythmic chirping of the cicadas in the mesquite trees and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. George and Norma were settling into the quiet comfort of their home when the shrill, mechanical ring of the heavy yellow landline phone shattered the peace. It rang with an urgency that seemed to make the very air in the kitchen freeze. Norma walked across the linoleum floor, the soles of her shoes squeaking softly, and picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end belonged to the local sheriff of Hays County. The words he spoke were fragmented, heavy with the grim duty of a man delivering a nightmare. There had been an automobile accident on the outskirts of San Marcos. A terrible wreck. Jennifer was in the vehicle. The transition from the warm, secure cocoon of the ranch to the sterile, terrifying reality of the hospital was a violent sensory shock. The headlights of George's truck cut frantically through the pitch-black Texas night, the tires screaming against the asphalt as they tore down the empty highway. Inside the cab, the silence was agonizing, filled only by the ragged, shallow breathing of two parents plunging into the abyss. When they pushed through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, the smell of harsh chemical antiseptic and stale coffee hit them like a physical blow. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a cold, sickly white glare, casting long, hollow shadows on the pale green walls. The world seemed to move in a horrific slow motion. A doctor, his face drawn and his eyes avoiding theirs, walked down the long, polished corridor. He did not need to speak a paragraph. The subtle, defeated shake of his head was enough to stop the rotation of the earth. When the fatal words finally left the doctor's mouth, George did not scream. He did not tear at his clothes or curse the heavens. The stoic, unshakable cowboy simply folded. His knees hit the hard, cold linoleum floor with a heavy thud. His pristine white cowboy hat, the crown of his public life, slipped from his fingers and rolled aimlessly down the empty hallway, coming to rest against a sterile white wall. The perfect, harmonious world of country music, the world of hit records and sold-out arenas, completely dissolved into a terrifying absolute silence. The days that followed were a blur of suffocating darkness and unbearable pain. The funeral was a sea of black clothes and hushed whispers under a gray, weeping sky. The Texas wind, usually a comforting companion, felt bitter and cold as it swept across the cemetery. The American media, a relentless machine hungry for the tears of the famous, descended upon the family. Cameras flashed from a distance. Reporters shouted questions, trying to pry open the shattered soul of a grieving father for the evening news. But George, drawing on the deepest reserves of his stoic nature, built an impenetrable fortress around his family. He made a vow, a silent, ironclad decision, right there beside the fresh earth of his daughter's grave. He would not offer his agony for public consumption. He would not give interviews. He would not speak of this to the flashing cameras. It was a rule he would maintain with fierce, unwavering discipline for decades. He retreated behind the heavy wooden gates of the ranch, pulling the world shut behind him. The sprawling house in San Antonio, once filled with the echoes of Jennifer's laughter and the warm strumming of acoustic guitars, slowly transformed into a silent mausoleum of memories. Every corner held a ghost, her boots by the back door, her favorite jacket hanging on the chair, the lingering scent of her perfume in the hallway. Norma walked through these rooms like a woman navigating a minefield, her own heart shattered into a million jagged pieces, yet forcing herself to breathe, to stand, to keep the foundation of the house from collapsing entirely. She watched with a quiet, agonizing desperation as the man she loved began to fade away into a ghost of himself. George was disappearing. The broad-shouldered cowboy who used to greet the morning sun with a cup of coffee and a quiet prayer now sat for hours in the darkened living room, staring blankly at the unlit fireplace. The phone rang constantly. Managers from Nashville, concert promoters, record executives, all of them offering condolences, but eventually asking the same question: when would he return? When would the tour resume? George ignored every single call. He walked into his study, a room lined with gold records and awards, and looked at his beloved acoustic guitars resting in their stands. The sight of the polished wood and the silver strings made him physically sick. Music was joy. Music was life. And his life was gone. With slow mechanical movements, he placed each guitar into its heavy black case. He snapped the metal latches shut. The sharp clicks echoed in the silent room like the slamming of a vault door. He pushed the cases deep into the back of his closet, burying them under old coats and blankets. The grief was no longer just an emotion. It was a living, breathing antagonist, a suffocating weight that sat on his chest and drained the color from his world. It was winning the battle. The king of country was preparing to abdicate his throne, ready to let the silence claim him forever. The Texas summer arrived with a brutal, unforgiving heat. The earth cracked, the grass turned a pale, brittle yellow, and the air shimmered above the asphalt. The heat mirrored the oppressive, stifling atmosphere inside the Strait home. The record label in Nashville was growing restless. Contracts were pending, studio time was booked, and the machinery of the music industry was demanding its star. But George had lost the very will to live his art. He moved through the days like a hollow shell, performing the basic chores of the ranch with a robotic, lifeless efficiency. He would mend a fence, feed the horses, clean the stalls, all without speaking a single word. His eyes, once bright with the quiet wisdom of the plains, were now dull and vacant, staring 1,000 miles past whatever he was looking at. It was late August, on an afternoon so hot it felt like the sky was pressing down on the earth. Norma had been searching for him. The house was empty, the truck was still parked by the porch, but George was nowhere to be seen. A deep, gnawing anxiety settled in her stomach as she walked out the back door, the dry dirt crunching beneath her boots. She checked the corral, the tack room, the feed shed. Nothing. Finally, she approached the large weathered barn at the edge of the property. The massive wooden doors were pulled shut, blocking out the fierce afternoon sun. She placed her hands on the rough, splintered wood and pushed. The door creaked open on its heavy iron hinges, slicing a narrow beam of dusty light into the cavernous darkness of the barn. The smell of old hay, dried sweat, and Neat's foot oil hung thick in the stagnant air. As Norma's eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw him. Deep in the back corner, surrounded by a pile of old, worn saddles and rusted tools, sat George. He was sitting on the dirt floor, his long legs drawn up, his face buried deep in his large calloused hands. His shoulders were shaking. It was not the loud, dramatic weeping of a movie, but the silent, agonizing sobs of a man whose spirit has been completely broken. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that fell across his boots. Norma stood frozen in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. This was the man who had always been the rock, the man who never complained, who shouldered every burden, who led his family with a quiet, unshakable faith. Seeing him crumbled in the dirt, entirely defeated by the weight of his sorrow, was a sight that tore at the very fabric of her soul. She walked slowly toward him, her footsteps muffled by the layer of dust and hay on the floor. She knelt down beside him, ignoring the dirt that stained her jeans. She did not speak immediately. She just placed a gentle, steady hand on his trembling back. The heat in the barn was suffocating, but the coldness radiating from his grief was worse. George slowly lifted his head. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, his eyes red and swollen. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ragged, barely audible whisper, scraped raw by months of suppressed agony. He told her it was over. He looked at the saddles, at his hands. Anywhere but into her eyes, he said he could not do it anymore. The thought of putting on that starched shirt, of stepping out under those blinding stage lights, of looking out into a sea of smiling faces and pretending that his heart was not a rotting, empty cavity in his chest, was impossible. He told her that every time he tried to hum a melody, all he heard was the sound of the tires screeching on the highway. He told her that the music had died the night Jennifer died. He was done. He would sell the contracts, pay back the label, and they would just disappear into the ranch. He was surrendering to the silence. The heavy, suffocating air inside the barn felt as though it had swallowed all the oxygen in the world. The silence that followed George's confession was not empty. It was dense, vibrating with the raw, bleeding agony of a man who had lost his compass, his anchor, and his very reason to draw breath. He sat there in the dry Texas dust, a towering figure of American stoicism, reduced to a fragile, broken shell. The dust motes swirling in the single shaft of sunlight seemed to mock the stillness of the room, dancing carelessly while the king of country music surrendered his crown to the shadows. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the dirt floor, unable to meet the gaze of the woman who shared his soul, terrified that if he looked into her eyes he would see the same bottomless void that was currently devouring him from the inside out. Norma did not move to wipe the dirt from her jeans. She did not flinch at the harshness of his words or the terrifying finality in his broken voice. She simply stayed kneeling beside him, feeling the rough, worn denim of his jeans against her own, grounding him in the physical world when his mind was drifting dangerously close to the edge of the abyss. She looked at his large, capable hands, hands that had built fences, broken horses, and held their newborn daughter with a gentleness that defied his rugged exterior. Now those hands lay limp and defeated in his lap. The smell of old leather and dried alfalfa was overpowering, a scent that had always meant home, but now felt like the interior of a tomb. She took a slow, deep breath, drawing the hot, stagnant air into her lungs. She was carrying the exact same mountain of grief on her own shoulders. Every morning she woke up, the realization that Jennifer's room was empty hit her with the force of a physical blow. But Norma possessed the quiet, steel-forged resilience of a Western woman. She knew that if she allowed George to bury himself in this barn, if she allowed him to lock his voice away in those dark closets, the tragedy would claim 2 lives instead of 1. She reached out, her fingers warm and steady, and placed both of her hands on the sides of his face. His skin was rough, weathered by years of sun and wind, and damp with tears he had sworn never to shed. She gently but firmly lifted his head until his bloodshot, hollow eyes were forced to meet hers. There was no pity in her gaze. Pity was a luxury they could not afford, a soft thing that would only pull them under. Instead, her eyes blazed with a fierce, unwavering love and a hard, undeniable truth. She did not offer him empty platitudes. She did not tell him that time would heal the wound, because they both knew that was a lie. Some wounds do not heal. They simply become a part of the landscape of your soul. "George," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the heavy silence of the barn like a silver blade. "You think this silence is protecting you. You think that by locking away your guitars and hiding in the dark, you are keeping her memory safe from the world. But you are wrong." He tried to pull away, to lower his head back into the comfortable darkness of his misery, but she held him firm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by a desperate need to save the man she loved. "If you stop singing," she continued, the words measured and heavy with consequence, "you are not protecting Jennifer. You are burying her twice." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. George flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. The accusation was brutal, but it was delivered with such profound love that it shattered the thick wall of numbness he had built around himself. He stared at her, his chest heaving, the implications of her words echoing in the vast empty spaces of his broken heart. Norma did not let up. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a fierce, intimate whisper. She reminded him of the golden evenings on the back porch, the sky painted in bruised purples and fiery oranges, when the air would cool and the crickets would begin their nightly chorus. She painted the picture for him, forcing him to see it. She reminded him of how Jennifer would come running out of the screen door, her boots clattering against the wooden planks, carrying a glass of sweet iced tea. She reminded him of how their daughter would sit cross-legged on the worn porch swing, her chin resting in her hands, her bright eyes fixed entirely on him as he tuned his acoustic guitar. "Do you remember how she looked at you?" Norma asked, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. "She was your biggest fan, George. Long before the stadiums, long before the gold records and the screaming crowds, it was just her. She loved the sound of your voice more than anything in this world. When you sang, she felt safe. When you sang, she was happy. And now you want to take that away? You want to take the very thing that brought her the most joy and lock it in a closet to gather dust?" George closed his eyes, a fresh wave of agony washing over him. The memory was so vivid, so intensely real, that he could almost smell the sweet tea and hear the creak of the porch swing. He could see her smile, that radiant, innocent smile that had been the light of his life. The realization of what Norma was saying began to seep into his bones. His silence, his retreat from the world, was not a tribute to his daughter. It was a surrender. It was letting the darkness win. "We are not going to let her name fade into an obituary," Norma said, her voice rising with a newfound conviction. "We are not going to let this tragedy be the end of her story. We are going to build something that matters." She told him her plan. It was an idea born in the sleepless, agonizing hours of the night, a desperate prayer turned into a concrete mission. They would create a foundation, the Jennifer Strait Memorial Foundation. They would use the money, the influence, the very fame that George had grown to despise, and they would turn it into a shield for others. They would fund charities, build shelters, support children who were suffering, children who needed a lifeline. They would take the absolute worst thing that could ever happen to a family and transmute it into an engine of grace and charity. They would keep her spirit alive in the laughter of children who had been saved from the brink. "But," Norma said, her voice softening, her thumbs gently wiping the dirt from his cheek, "to do that, to build this foundation, to make her name mean hope for thousands of people, I need my husband back. The world does not need a broken cowboy hiding in a barn. The world needs George Strait, and Jennifer needs her father to stand up and sing. She slowly released his face and stood up. The barn seemed to hold its breath. George remained on the floor, his mind reeling, the tectonic plates of his grief shifting under the weight of her words. He watched as Norma turned and walked out of the barn, her silhouette framed against the blinding Texas sun for a brief moment before she disappeared toward the house. He sat alone in the dust for what felt like hours. The shadows in the barn began to lengthen, stretching across the dirt floor as the afternoon sun began its slow descent. The heat began to break, replaced by the subtle, cooling breeze of the approaching evening. Inside his chest, a war was raging. The desire to simply lay down and let the earth reclaim him fought bitterly against the profound, undeniable truth of his wife's words. He thought of his faith, the quiet, steadfast Christian values that had guided his entire life. He thought of the concept of service, of carrying a cross not just for oneself, but for the betterment of others. If he stayed on this floor, the tragedy was meaningless. If he stood up, the pain would become a purpose. The heavy wooden doors of the barn creaked again. George looked up. Norma was walking back toward him. In her right hand, she carried a heavy, battered black case. It was his oldest acoustic guitar, the one he had played in the small, smoky honky-tonks before anyone knew his name. The one Jennifer had learned to walk holding onto. She stopped a few feet away from him and gently laid the case flat on the dirt floor. She knelt down and snapped the heavy metal latches. The sharp, mechanical clicks echoed loudly in the quiet barn. She opened the lid. The interior was lined with faded red velvet, and resting inside was the beautiful polished wood of the instrument. The smell of aged spruce, brass strings, and old rosin drifted into the air, a scent so familiar and deeply ingrained in George's soul that it made his hands twitch. Norma reached in, lifted the guitar by the neck, and held it out to him. "Play," she whispered. "Just one chord. For her." George stared at the instrument. It looked incredibly heavy, as if it were carved from solid lead. His hands, still resting on his knees, felt clumsy and numb. Slowly, with agonizing hesitation, he reached out. His calloused fingers brushed against the smooth wood of the body. A jolt of electricity seemed to shoot up his arm. He grasped the neck, his thumb finding its familiar resting place, and pulled the guitar onto his lap. The wood felt warm against his chest. He placed his left hand over the fretboard, his fingers automatically forming the shape of a simple G chord. He raised his right hand. His thumb hovered over the heavy brass strings. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He thought of the porch swing. He thought of the bright, shining eyes of a 13-year-old girl. He struck the strings. The sound exploded in the quiet barn. It was loud, resonant, and deeply out of tune. The discordant notes clashed in the air, a harsh, ugly sound that perfectly mirrored the shattered state of his soul. But it was a sound. It was not silence. The vibration traveled from the wooden body of the guitar, through his ribs and directly into his heart. It was a painful sensation, like blood rushing back into a limb that had been asleep for months. George opened his eyes. He looked down at the strings, then up at Norma. She was smiling, a small, fragile smile, but her eyes were shining with a profound, overwhelming relief. The iron grip of the paralysis had been broken. The stoic cowboy had found his armor again, not made of silence but of melody. With slow, deliberate movements, George reached up to the tuning pegs. He plucked the low E string, listening to the flat, dead tone, and slowly turned the metal peg until the note rose, tightening, stretching, until it rang true and clear. He moved to the next string, and the next, his ear guiding his hands, bringing the chaotic, broken instrument back into perfect harmony. It was a painstaking process, a physical manifestation of putting his own fractured mind back together. When the guitar was finally in tune, he strummed the G chord again. This time the sound was pure, rich, and golden. It filled the dusty barn with a warmth that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. A single tear escaped his eye, tracking a clean line through the dust on his cheek, and fell, landing silently on the polished wood of the guitar. He did not wipe it away. He looked at Norma, his jaw set, the familiar, quiet strength returning to his posture. "Call Nashville," he said. His voice was still rough, still thick with unshed tears, but the absolute finality of defeat was gone. "Call them. Tell them I am coming back." The decision was made, but the journey had only just begun. The transition from the isolated sanctuary of the Texas ranch to the high-pressure, neon-lit world of Music Row in Nashville was a daunting prospect. The music industry is a beast that does not pause for grief. It demands product, it demands smiles, and it demands performances. George knew that walking into that studio would be walking into a minefield of sympathetic looks, hushed whispers, and suffocating expectations. He knew that the media would be circling like vultures, waiting for the king of country to crack, waiting for a sensational quote or a public breakdown. But his resolve was now forged in the fires of a father's love. He was no longer going back to be a star. He was going back to be a provider. He was going back to build a monument for his daughter. The morning they left the ranch, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew on the sagebrush. George stood on the front porch, dressed in a clean, starched shirt, his boots polished to a dull shine. He held his black Stetson in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He looked out over the sprawling acres of his property, the wooden fences stretching out toward the horizon, the horses grazing peacefully in the distance. This was his sanctuary, the place where he had wanted to hide forever. But as he looked at the empty porch swing gently swaying in the morning breeze, he knew he could not stay. Norma came out of the house carrying a small travel bag. She stopped beside him, reaching out to link her arm through his. They stood there in silence for a long moment, drawing strength from the land and from each other. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. George placed the Stetson on his head, pulling the brim down low over his eyes to shield them from the rising sun. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, his posture straightening, his broad shoulders squaring against the invisible weight he carried. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady and low. "Let's go to work." The drive to the airport was quiet. The rhythmic hum of the truck tires on the asphalt was the only sound in the cab. George kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the endless stretch of highway unfolding before them. His mind was already miles away, bracing for the sterile environment of the recording studio, the heavy padded doors, the tangle of microphone cables, and the expectant faces of the producers behind the thick glass. He had received the demo tapes weeks ago, before the darkness had completely consumed him. There was one song in particular that the label executives were pushing. It was a song he had not written, but when he had first read the lyric sheet, it felt as though someone had reached into his chest and pulled the words directly from his bleeding heart. It was a song about loss, about a love that fades away too soon, about a memory that lingers like a ghost. It was called Baby Blue. He had refused to listen to the demo tape. The mere thought of hearing those words sung out loud had been too much to bear. But now, as the truck sped toward the airport, the lyrics played over and over in his mind. He knew that this song would be his crucible. It would be the ultimate test of his resolve. To sing those words, to pour his shattered soul into a microphone for the world to hear, would require a level of vulnerability that terrified him more than any physical danger ever could. The flight to Tennessee was a blur of clouds and engine noise. When they finally touched down in Nashville, the atmosphere was entirely different. The humid, heavy air of the South lacked the dry, biting edge of the Texas plains. The city was alive with the sound of traffic, the glare of neon signs from the honky-tonks on Broadway, and the relentless, buzzing energy of the music business. A black town car was waiting for them at the airport. The driver, a professional who knew better than to make small talk with a grieving superstar, simply nodded, loaded their bags, and opened the door. The ride to the studio was tense. George stared out the tinted window, watching the familiar landmarks of Music Row roll by. The grand, historic buildings that housed the legendary record labels, the small, cramped publishing houses where songwriters toiled over legal pads, the famous studios where history had been etched onto magnetic tape. This was his kingdom, the place where he had built his empire. But today, it felt like an execution chamber. The car pulled up to the back entrance of a massive, nondescript brick building. This was it. There were no flashing cameras here, no screaming fans, just a heavy steel door that led into the belly of the beast. George took a deep breath. the scent of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt filling his lungs. He looked at Norma. She gave him a slow, reassuring nod. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The air conditioning hit him instantly, chilling the sweat on the back of his neck. The hallway was lined with gold and platinum records, a silent testament to the ghosts of country music past. The muffled thump of a bass drum could be heard from behind one of the heavy studio doors. As they walked down the corridor towards Studio A, the tension in the air grew palpable. The people they passed, engineers carrying coils of cables, session musicians hauling guitar cases, assistants rushing with trays of coffee, all stopped and stared. The silence that followed in their wake was deafening. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone knew that the king of country had lost his princess, and no one knew what to say. George kept his eyes straight ahead, his face an impenetrable mask of stoic resolve. He offered polite, brief nods to the people he recognized, his cowboy hat tipped respectfully, but he did not stop to chat. He was a man on a mission, walking toward the microphone that would either break him completely or set him free. They reached the heavy, soundproof door of Studio A. A red light glowed ominously above the frame, indicating that the room was ready. George reached out, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. He paused for a fraction of a second, the weight of the moment pressing down on him with crushing force. This was the threshold. Once he crossed it, there was no turning back. He pushed the door open, and the silence of the hallway was instantly replaced by the low murmur of voices, the tuning of instruments, and the sterile smell of electronic equipment. The room was full of people. The best session players in Nashville were sitting in a semicircle, their instruments resting on their laps. The producer, a veteran of the industry with 100 hit records under his belt, stood behind the massive mixing console in the control room, his face pale and tight with anxiety. The moment George stepped into the room, all conversation ceased. The silence was absolute, thick with an uncomfortable, agonizing reverence. The musicians shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their eyes darting away, unable to look the grieving father in the face. The air was charged with a tension so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. George walked slowly to the center of the room, his boots clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He took off his hat and placed it carefully on a small wooden stool. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every single person present. He saw their pity, their fear, their uncertainty. "Good morning, gentlemen," George said, his voice calm, steady, and incredibly polite. The musicians murmured their replies, a chorus of hushed, respectful greetings. "I appreciate you all being here today," George continued, stepping up to the microphone stand. He adjusted the height, his large hands moving with practiced precision. "Let's not waste any time. We have a lot of work to do." He looked through the thick pane of glass into the control room. Norma was standing there, right behind the producer. She had her arms crossed, her posture straight, her eyes locked entirely on him. She gave him a barely perceptible nod. George reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the lyric sheet for Baby Blue. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases against his thigh. He placed it on the music stand in front of him. The words stared back at him, sharp and cruel, demanding to be spoken. He leaned into the microphone, the metal grill cold against his lips. "I'm ready," he said to the control room. "Let's cut this track." The heavy steel door of the soundproof vocal booth clicked shut behind George, sealing him inside a world of absolute, terrifying isolation. The air in the booth was freezing, heavily air-conditioned to protect the sensitive vintage microphones, and it smelled faintly of warm dust, hot electrical tubes, and ozone. Through the thick, double-paned glass, he could see the control room. It looked like the bridge of a submarine, bathed in the dim amber glow of the massive mixing console. The producer, a man who had guided legends through their darkest hours, sat motionless in his leather chair, his fingers hovering over the heavy plastic buttons of the tape machine. Behind him stood Norma. She was a statue of pure, unyielding Texas granite, her jaw set, her eyes locked onto George with a fierce, protective intensity. She did not offer a comforting smile. A smile would have shattered him. She offered him strength, the kind of quiet, enduring strength that had conquered the western frontiers. George adjusted the heavy black headphones over his ears. The padded cups blocked out the ambient noise of the room. replacing it with a low, electronic hiss. He stepped up to the microphone, a massive silver cylinder suspended by a web of elastic cords. He reached out and gripped the cold metal stand with his right hand, his knuckles turning white as he squeezed. He closed his eyes and took a slow, deep breath, pulling the freezing air deep into his lungs. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive downward motion of his chin. In the control room, the producer pressed the heavy red button. The massive reels of the 2-inch magnetic tape machine began to spin, emitting a soft, mechanical whir that sounded like the ticking of a giant clock, counting down the seconds to his reckoning. "Rolling," the producer said, his voice crackling softly through George's headphones. "Take 1. The silence stretched for an agonizing second. Then the session musicians in the main room began to play. The sound bled into George's headphones with crystal clarity. The slow, mournful weeping of a pedal steel guitar cut through the air, followed by the gentle, rhythmic strumming of an acoustic guitar. It was a beautiful, melancholic melody, crafted by master musicians, but to George, it sounded like a funeral march. The music swelled, building the foundation for the vocal entrance. The lyrics on the paper in front of him seemed to blur, the black ink swimming on the white page. The cue arrived. George opened his mouth. He drew in a breath to sing the first line, to sing about the girl with the bright blue eyes who had slipped through his fingers like dry Texas sand. But the words did not come. Instead of a note, a harsh, jagged gasp tore from his throat. The sheer, crushing weight of the lyrics slammed into his chest with the force of a runaway freight train. The image of Jennifer, laughing in the golden afternoon sun, flashed behind his eyelids with blinding brilliance. His throat closed completely, locked tight by an invisible iron fist. He choked, a raw, ugly sound that echoed painfully through the sensitive microphone and blasted into the control room. He let go of the microphone stand and stumbled backward, his boots scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He turned his back to the glass, ripping the heavy headphones from his ears and throwing them onto a nearby chair. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders heaving as he fought a desperate losing battle against the rising tide of his grief. In the main studio, the music ground to a halt. The steel guitar player rested his hands on the strings, silencing the weeping instrument. The acoustic guitar player slowly lowered his pick. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier, darker, and more suffocating than before. It was the sound of a man breaking in half. In the control room, the producer reached out to stop the tape, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously toward Norma. He opened his mouth to speak, to suggest they cancel the session, to say that it was too soon, that no man could be expected to sing through this kind of agony. But Norma raised her hand, a sharp, commanding gesture that instantly silenced the room. She did not look at the producer. She did not look at the sound engineers who were staring at the floor in uncomfortable reverence. Her eyes remained fixed entirely on the broad, shaking back of her husband on the other side of the glass. She stepped closer to the window, placing her palm flat against the cold, thick pane. "George," she said. Her voice did not travel through the intercom. It was muffled by the heavy glass, but the tone, the absolute unwavering command in her voice, penetrated the soundproof walls. Inside the booth, George heard the faint sound of his name. He slowly lowered his hands. His face was a mask of pure devastation, his eyes red and shining with unshed tears, his jaw trembling. He turned around slowly, his boots feeling like they were made of solid lead. He looked through the glass. He saw Norma's hand pressed against the window. He saw the fierce, burning light in her eyes. It was the same light he had seen in the dusty barn, the light that demanded he rise from the dirt. She was not asking him to stop hurting. She was asking him to use the hurt. She was reminding him of the promise they had made, the foundation they were going to build, the legacy they were going to forge from the ashes of their shattered world. She was telling him, without a single spoken word, that he was not alone in the dark. George stared at her for a long, timeless moment. The frantic beating of his heart began to slow. The trembling in his hands subsided, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He walked slowly back to the chair, picked up the heavy headphones, and placed them deliberately back over his ears. He stepped up to the microphone stand. He did not grip it this time. He let his arms hang loosely at his sides. He closed his eyes, tilting his head slightly upward, as if searching for a face in the sterile acoustic foam of the ceiling. He pressed the talkback button on the microphone stand. "Roll the tape," he said. His voice was no longer shaking. It was low, gravelly, and completely stripped of all pretense. It was the voice of a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and had decided to sing about it. In the control room, the producer swallowed hard and pressed the red button again. The heavy reels spun. "Take two," the producer whispered. The pedal steel guitar wept once more. The acoustic guitar strummed its mournful rhythm. The melody filled George's ears, but this time he did not fight it. He let the music wash over him, let it seep into the cracked, broken places of his heart. As the cue approached, he did not think about the lyrics on the page. He thought about the color blue. He thought about the endless Texas sky on a clear summer morning. He thought about his daughter. George opened his mouth and he sang. The voice that came through the massive studio monitors in the control room was not the polished, perfect baritone that had sold millions of records. It was something entirely different. It was raw, frayed at the edges, and dripping with an emotion so profound and unguarded that it felt almost invasive to listen to. He sang the words with a devastating restraint, a quiet, desperate pleading that bypassed the ears and went straight into the marrow of the bone. Every note was a tear he refused to shed. Every phrase was a desperate grasp at a memory that was fading into the ether. He sang about the breathless beauty of a fleeting moment. He sang about a love that was too pure for this world, a light that burned so brightly it had to be extinguished. As he reached the chorus, his voice soared, carrying the crushing weight of a father's eternal goodbye. It was not a performance. It was a confession. It was an act of bloodletting captured on magnetic tape. In the main studio, the seasoned session musicians, men who had played on thousands of records and had seen every trick in the industry, stopped looking at their sheet music. The fiddle player, an old weathered man from the deep woods of East Texas, closed his eyes, and a single tear tracked down the deep wrinkles of his cheek, disappearing into his gray beard. The producer in the control room sat frozen, his hands trembling over the mixing board, entirely forgetting to adjust the levels. He was witnessing a moment of pure, transcendent human truth, a moment where art and agony become completely indistinguishable. Through it all, Norma stood at the glass. She did not cry. She kept her palm pressed against the window, her eyes locked on George, anchoring him to the earth as he poured his soul into the microphone. She was his compass, guiding him through the darkest storm he would ever face. When the final note of the song faded into silence, the ringing of the acoustic guitar slowly dying away, nobody moved. The heavy reels of the tape machine continued to spin, the soft mechanical whir the only sound in the building. George stood in the booth, his head bowed, his chest rising and falling with slow, exhausted breaths. He had given everything. There was nothing left inside him but a vast, echoing emptiness. But it was no longer an emptiness of despair. It was the emptiness of a vessel that had finally been poured out. He slowly reached up and took off the headphones. He looked through the glass. Norma nodded, a slow, deep nod of profound respect and infinite love. The recording session was over. The silence that filled the studio was no longer the suffocating silence of grief, but the holy, reverent silence of a sanctuary after a prayer has been spoken. George Strait had not broken his rule. He had not given an interview. He had not sold his tears to the flashing cameras. He had simply walked to the microphone and told the world exactly how much his heart was bleeding. The aftermath of that day in Nashville shifted the trajectory of country music, but more importantly, it shifted the trajectory of the Strait family's legacy. When the song Baby Blue was finally released to the public, it did not arrive with a massive promotional campaign. It arrived quietly, slipping onto the radio airwaves like a gentle Texas breeze. But the moment people heard it, they understood. The public, who had respected George's stoic silence, heard the unvarnished agony in his voice. They felt the phantom presence of the 13-year-old girl in every haunting note. The song climbed the Billboard charts with an unstoppable, quiet momentum, reaching the #1 spot, not because it was a catchy tune, but because it was a masterpiece of human vulnerability. But the true victory was not measured in record sales or chart positions. The true victory took root back in the dry, dusty soil of Texas. True to Norma's fierce promise in the barn, the Jennifer Strait Memorial Foundation was born. It was not launched with a glamorous gala or a red carpet event. It was built quietly, funded by the proceeds of the music, and driven by the unwavering dedication of a mother and father who refused to let their daughter's light go out. The foundation reached into the forgotten corners of the state. It found the children who were hurting, the families who had lost their homes to fire or flood, the small underfunded shelters that were struggling to keep their doors open. In a dusty town near the Mexican border, a young boy with a severe illness received the medical care his family could never afford, his hospital bills paid in full by a silent benefactor. In a crowded city, a shelter for abused children received a massive shipment of new beds, warm blankets, and school supplies. Every time a check was written, every time a child smiled because of the foundation's work, the memory of Jennifer Strait breathed again. The tragedy that had threatened to destroy the king of country had been miraculously transmuted into an engine of profound, enduring charity. The healing of the Strait family was not a sudden cinematic revelation. It was a slow, grueling process, much like watching the Texas plains recover after a devastating drought. There were still days when the grief would rise up like a sudden, violent dust storm, choking the breath from their lungs, but they no longer hid in the dark. When the pain came, they leaned on each other, their bond forged into unbreakable steel by the fire they had walked through together. George returned to the stage, his voice deeper, richer, and carrying a new, profound gravity. He sang the old hits, he smiled for the crowds, but the fans knew that behind the starched shirt and the perfect cowboy hat was a man who had paid the ultimate price for his wisdom. Decades passed. The years turned George's dark hair to a distinguished silver, and the lines around his eyes deepened, etched by thousands of miles on the road and thousands of hours under the blinding stage lights. His legacy as the undisputed king of country music was cemented in history, his records breaking every conceivable record, his name synonymous with the very soul of the American West. But the true measure of the man was never found in the platinum plaques that lined the walls of his study. The narrative comes full circle, snapping back to the brutal, deafening roar of the 80,000 fans in the massive Texas stadium. The concrete walls vibrate, the air is thick with anticipation, and the blinding spotlights sweep across the sea of cowboy hats. Inside the small, dimly lit dressing room, the silence is finally broken. George Strait sits on the worn leather sofa, staring at the faded, dog-eared photograph of Jennifer. The trembling in his hands has stopped. The crushing weight that had slumped his shoulders is still there. It will always be there, but he has learned how to carry it. He traces the edge of the photograph with his calloused thumb, a gentle, reverent touch. He does not cry. He smiles, a small, private smile that holds a lifetime of love and a river of unshed tears. He slowly folds the photograph and places it carefully into the breast pocket of his starched western shirt, right over his heart. He stands up. He reaches for his pristine white Stetson, resting on the table beside him, and places it squarely on his head, pulling the brim down low over his eyes. He checks the heavy silver buckle on his belt, adjusts his cuffs, and turns toward the heavy steel door. As he pushes the door open, the wall of sound hits him like a physical blow. The roar of the crowd is a living, breathing entity, a massive wave of adoration that washes over him. He walks down the long, concrete tunnel, his boots clicking rhythmically against the floor, his stride slow, deliberate, and perfectly composed. He is the stoic cowboy once again, the impenetrable icon of the West. But as he reaches the edge of the stage, the darkness of the tunnel giving way to the blinding, explosive light of the arena, he pauses. He looks to the wings. Standing there, just out of sight of the 80,000 screaming fans, is Norma. Her hair is silver now, but her posture is as straight and unyielding as it was in that dusty barn decades ago. She looks at him, her eyes shining with that same fierce, protective light. She gives him a slow, deep nod. The silent communication between them speaks volumes, a testament to a partnership that survived the end of the world. George nods back. He steps out into the light, The crowd erupts into absolute pandemonium. The noise is deafening, a chaotic symphony of cheers and applause. George walks to the center of the stage, the heat of the spotlights washing over him. He takes his acoustic guitar from a stagehand and slips the leather strap over his shoulder. He steps up to the microphone. He does not speak immediately. He looks out over the massive sea of faces, feeling the energy, the love, and the expectation. Then slowly he tips his head back and looks up past the blinding rig of stage lights, up toward the dark, endless expanse of the Texas night sky. He stands there for a long moment, a silent communion between a father and the stars. He lowers his head, looks straight into the crowd and strikes the first chord on his guitar. The sound rings out, clear, golden, and pure, cutting through the roar of the stadium. It is the sound of survival. It is the sound of a man who learned that true strength is not found in the absence of tears, nor in the ability to hide from the pain. True strength is found in the courage to stand up in the dirt, tune a broken guitar, and continue singing when your heart has been shattered into a million unfixable pieces. The music fills the stadium, carrying the weight of a legacy built not on fame, but on faith, resilience, and the quiet, colossal strength of a family that refused to let the silence win.